Good morning.
In unison, good morning.
In unison, good morning, Your Honor.
You may proceed, counsel.
Thank you, Your Honor. Okay, good morning.
Good morning.
How are you doing?
Good.
I just have a few more questions for you. At the end of the day yesterday, you testified, and there was a slide presentation wherein 19 prints were shown, latent prints. Is that correct?
Correct.
Just to remind the jury, you had the big charts on poster board, and then a PowerPoint presentation was presented to the jury on the screen, correct?
That's correct.
Those were 19.
I'll just object as misstates the evidence. That this witness was shown only 16 cards, exhibits.
Okay. Alright, you're aware that there were 19 prints. You looked at some of them and you did not identify them. Is that correct?
That's correct. Those were processed by another investigator.
You had a total of 19 prints up there, and you were able to identify 16 as something you processed?
I had a hand in processing 16 of them, yes.
There you go. Of the 16 you processed, and the other 3 that you're aware of, totaling 19, those are from a collection of how many usable latent prints?
From what I understand, there was.
I'll object as lacks foundation.
Sustained.
Alright, your unit was responsible for processing the prints, is that correct?
That's correct.
And by that we mean trying to locate all of the usable prints, the prints that look like they might have enough detail to use them for comparison purposes, correct?
Correct.
And who is in charge of your unit? Who was in charge of this process?
As far as looking at
As far as developing the prints so that you get to the point where you have visible prints.
Well, ID technician Torres and I were involved in the process in Santa Maria. And Detective Wittenbrock and ID tech Shelley were involved in the process in Santa Barbara.
Alright, and did you confer with Detective Wittenbrock and ID tech Shelley to determine the status of their work?
Yes.
And did you look at the materials that they had accumulated?
No.
You haven't looked at them at all?
I have seen some of the prints that were displayed, but not all of the prints that they submitted as usable.
Okay, and so the team was comprised of the 4 of you, 2 in Santa Maria, 2 in Santa Barbara?
Correct.
And did you ever have a final, well, let's not put it that way. Did you ever have any kind of a meeting where you sat down, and you said, okay, this is the body of material that we have, we're going to turn it over to the latent print examiners to take a look at it?
No.
How many prints did you come up with in your operation in Santa Maria, that being the operation between you and ID Tech Torres? How many prints?
We submitted, I believe, a total of about 600, approximately. I think there was 600 that we submitted.
And so I guess what you're saying is, you have no idea how many were submitted by Detective Wittenbrock and ID Tech Shelley in Santa Barbara?
I'm not sure of the exact amount. I know there was, I think in the neighborhood of a total of 700, but I'm not sure of the exact figure.
Total of 700 from them, or 700?
700 total.
Okay, so you submitted the bulk of them. They came up with a smaller number?
Correct. We had the bulk of the items.
So out of the 600 prints or so that you developed, the 600 or so usable prints that you developed, there were 16 that you have shown us yesterday. Is that correct?
Correct.
And out of the approximate other 100, apparently the other 3 were the result of that. Is that correct?
That's my understanding.
Now, of all those usable prints, most of them were negative for the, is that your understanding?
Yes.
Alright, okay.
I'll object and move to strike as ambiguous, vague, negative.
Sustained. Stricken.
The process that you used involved a scene scope.
Correct.
And reminding everybody, they've probably got that by now. You talked about the ALS also in your testimony yesterday, and I want to clarify this. ALS is different than scene scope when you're using those terms, is that correct?
That is correct.
And you mentioned that there had been an ALS evaluation of the materials in item 317 that occurred before you had begun to look at them for prints. Is that correct?
That's my understanding. I don't believe I did item 317 ALS, but I know I did ALS on certain items, and I'm assuming that was done on others.
You understand that somebody else did that?
That's my understanding, but I don't believe I said specifically I did that one.
And that ALS, whatever ALS process was done either by you or anybody else, did that do anything to affect the ability to obtain prints?
No, it did not.
Now, you indicated that in your process, you did the superglue fuming first, then you did the scenescope, then you did the ninhydrin process. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So therefore, you did not use the scenescope before doing the superglue fuming. Is that correct?
Not in our process, no.
Now, you're familiar with the scenescope technology, I take it, correct?
Yes.
And you're aware that you can use the scenescope before you do any chemical alterations to the paper. Is that correct?
That's correct. We had not used in our process protocol, but we had used the scenescope to look at pages prior to doing our protocol to see if we could observe any images. And we did not have what I would consider sufficient results that way, so we went to doing the super glued technique.
So how, in other words, before you tamper with it, and I don't mean that in a bad way, but before you chemically alter with super glue, it is possible to use a scenescope and try to find prints in their more or less natural state, correct?
That's correct.
And you're saying you tried that on a few pages first?
We did some test pages.
About how many test pages did you do?
Just a few. I don't know exactly how many.
And how many pages did you have overall?
Of.
That you ultimately examined?
Over, I don't know, 1,000.
Alright, so it was your determination not to do a thorough scenescope examination of the thousands of pages before doing the super glue fuming as a result of that test. Is that correct?
That's correct. And one of the things that's mentioned in the scenescope literature, and also in talking to their specialist, is that if you cannot visualize prints, your best method is to then move to the super glue, because it will have the best results, especially with the scenescope. Best results are with super glue process.
I'm going to move to strike that as hearsay and non-responsive after. Yes, I think it was, or after, that's correct.
Stricken after. That's correct. I wonder if you could try to speak a little louder or lean a little closer. I can hear you, but it's, go ahead.
And I have no further questions at this time. Laughter.
Good morning, Detective Sutcliffe.
Good morning.
I believe Mr. Sanger used the word, chemically alter. Is that an accurate description of what happens when you fume a page with the superglue?
The super glue fumes are adhering to the residues that are left on the page, so.
Okay. Does the fingerprint itself get altered?
No.
Objection. That's leading.
This is an expert witness.
The answer was, no. Next question.
Now, in your experience as a forensics detective, how many times, if you can estimate, have you been asked to look for fingerprints on a given item?
Daily.
Okay. Hundreds of times?
Thousands of times.
Thousands of times, in hundreds of cases or more.
Yes.
When you look for a fingerprint on an item, do you always find it?
No.
Do you always find some fingerprints on an item you're looking for fingerprints on?
No, we do not.
If you were asked to characterize the percentage of items that you looked for fingerprints on and you actually find a usable fingerprint on, what percentage would you say?
Objection. Relevance. Improper foundation.
Sustained. Relevance.
This is offered not only for the magazines, but for other evidence in this case.
You may proceed.
Not relevant? Alright. Mr. Sanger asked you some questions yesterday about the use of digital cameras with the scenescope.
Correct.
And have you had a chance to do some research on that topic as to whether or not a digital camera is sufficient or adequate to use with a scenescope in capturing fingerprint images?
Yes, I have.
What did you do?
I contacted the Specs Corporation this morning and talked with a representative there.
Have you? Did you find out whether or not Specs Corporation actually offers their scenescope with a digital camera, as you mentioned you believe it did yesterday?
Yes, they do.
Objection. Asked and answered. And also for hearsay, for that matter.
It goes to, it's expert testimony, Your Honor.
Hearsay. Sustained.
Do you know, based upon your training, education, and experience, including any training you've received from the CineScope Corporation, as to whether or not a digital camera is sufficient to capture fingerprint images using a CineScope?
Objection. That calls for hearsay, and it's also vague.
Overruled. You may answer that question.
Yes, I do.
And do you know if a 4-megapixel camera is sufficient, pursuant to CineScope recommendations, to capture such images?
Yes. And actually, they had offered originally a 3-megapixel.
Move to strike after the answer, yes.
Stricken.
Do you know if CineScope has even recommended a lesser resolution camera, such as a 3-megapixel camera, to capture fingerprint images?
Yes, they do.
Objection. Calls for hearsay.
It's his training.
Sustained.
When you use the digital camera, does the camera itself have different levels of resolution that you can set the camera to?
Yes.
And what level of resolution do you use on this 4-megapixel camera?
We use JPEG, the highest resolution, lowest compression.
Okay. And does that capture the clearest images?
Yes, in JPEG format.
One last bit of housekeeping, Your Honor. I provided counsel with a copy of what I have marked as People's Exhibit 769. These are the images that I have provided, showed on the PowerPoint, but I didn't introduce yesterday. And I'd like to just ask the witness a couple of foundational questions concerning this exhibit.
All right.
Well, I'm going to object. It's beyond the scope of direct. Beyond the scope of cross.
I believe there was some questions about the testimony yesterday concerning given images. And if there is a problem, I would ask to reopen for that limited purpose.
Does Your Honor know what pictures he's talking about? They're the ones subject to the 352.
No, I don't.
I've got a copy.
These are the pictures he showed yesterday.
That's correct.
I've already ruled on the 352.
Well, my objection is that this is beyond the scope of cross. I didn't ask about these pictures. I was just referring to the 352 so Your Honor would know what we were talking about.
All right, thank you. The questions that you wanted to ask him are foundational questions that you omitted to ask on direct?
Well, just concerning this particular exhibit. I just want to tie this particular exhibit up with the presentation that we gave yesterday.
All right, I'll allow that.
All right.
Whose is this?
Detective, I show you Exhibit 769. It is a notebook which appears to have 19 pages in it, and I want you to look particularly to page number 2. I'm going to name some different page numbers. Let's do it this way. I'll provide with you page numbers, and I'll ask you if these page numbers correspond. If the fingerprint on these particular pages correspond with the 16 print cards that you identified yesterday as being prints that you located.
Okay.
All right. And I'll do it serially. Well, we can do it one at a time. Does page number 2 correspond to the print card noted as exhibit number 725-02?
Yes, it does.
Does page number 3 correspond with the exhibit number 726, print card 03?
Yes, it does.
And those were prints that you found, correct?
That's correct.
And these are identical photos as to what was shown yesterday as to where these prints were located on these particular pages.
That's correct.
All right. Does page number 5, the ninhydrin print, correspond to the fingerprint that's noted on exhibit 728-05?
Yes, it does.
Does page number 6 of this exhibit correspond with the fingerprint that is shown on exhibit 729-06?
Yes, it does.
Does page number 7 of exhibit 769 correspond? Have a fingerprint on it that corresponds with the fingerprint on exhibit 730, identified as card 07?
Yes, it does.
Does page number 8, the fingerprint thereon, correspond with the fingerprint that's located on card No, exhibit number 731, card number 08?
Yes, it does.
Showing you page number 9 of that exhibit. Does the fingerprint on that page correspond with the fingerprint on card number 9, exhibit number 732?
Yes, it does.
Skipping ahead to page number 12, does that fingerprint on exhibit 769 on page 12, correspond to the fingerprint on exhibit number 735, card 12?
Yes, it does.
Skipping one page. Page 14. Does the fingerprint on that card correspond with the fingerprint on the card noted as Exhibit 737, number 14?
Yes, it does.
Looking at page 15. Does the fingerprint on that page correspond with the fingerprint on exhibit number 738, noted as card 15?
Yes, it does.
Going ahead to 16, page 16. Does the fingerprint on that card correspond to the fingerprint on exhibit 739, noted as card 16?
Yes, it does.
And lastly, showing you page 17. That's not yours, sorry. I'm going to show you card 18. Does card 18 correspond with the fingerprint that is noted on page 18? Does this correspond with exhibit number 741, card 18?
Yes, it does.
Alright, and you located each of those fingerprints?
That's correct.
And this exhibit contains the fingerprint that you've noted with the exact page that it was located on and the location of the fingerprint on that page?
That's correct.
Thank you. Move to admit Exhibit 769 into evidence at this time.
I'm not sure that 769 have the other pages in it that haven't been identified yet.
That's fair. That's fair. Actually, I will reserve that. I'll hold off on moving to admit that into evidence. There's additional foundation that I need to add.
All right.
All right. Thank you. No further questions.
Do you have 741 in front of you, Exhibit 741?
Is that?
May I approach, Your Honor?
Yes.
If I can assist. That is 741.
Thank you.
Exhibit 741 you have now identified as relating to a particular page in the book that was just marked for identification, correct?
Correct.
Now, that was originally attributed to a totally different magazine, a different exhibit, was it not?
Correct. That placard number belonged to 321D, which was a Hawk magazine.
Okay. And did you confer with Detective Spinner about the misidentification of the location of that particular print?
I conferred with him about the misleading of the binders, yes.
So there was a misattribution, in your opinion at this time, of that print to, in essence, the wrong magazine?
I'll object as vague as to misattribution.
Overruled.
I don't know what that means.
Okay, that's a good point. When the fingerprint team was working on this, that particular print was originally identified to. I want to get the right number here, 321D, correct?
That's correct.
And 321D, I'm sorry?
I was going to say that was based on us receiving the binder with the label, and when we opened the binder, we went to work on that particular magazine, which was finally legal.
Okay, the binder was labeled as 321D?
Mislabeled.
Alright, we'll get to misattribution anytime now. Alright, the binder was mislabeled as 321D, correct?
And that was the only identifier on the binder.
Okay, so there was no other way to establish, as you look at it, as to what exhibit that actually was.
Correct.
And you would agree, based on your training and experience, that it's important to try to label all these things carefully so that ultimately, if you're called to testify in court, you can get it right?
Absolutely.
Okay, and eventually it was determined, you believe at this time, that print really came off a different magazine?
Oh, I know it did.
Okay, that's your testimony at this point.
Correct.
Alright, and by the way, the fingerprints that you lifted, do you have any way to determine the age of the fingerprints?
No.
So you can't tell if one was laid down before another, correct?
Correct.
And you can't tell, just even in general, other than, for instance, looking at the date of a magazine or something like that, you can't tell scientifically when a particular print was placed there.
Correct.
Okay, now, Mr. Auchincloss led off with a question about chemically altered. The fact is that superglue fuming does chemically alter the exhibit, does it not, sir?
It adheres to the prints that are on, or whatever residue is left on there. I don't believe it chemically alters the prints, the process, the superglue itself.
Alright, in talking about the word alter, then, if you put superglue on something, superglue is a chemical, right?
Correct.
And you're not altering the exhibit by putting super glue on something. Is that your definition?
My understanding, yes.
Okay. Now, aside from that, you do agree with me that when you put super glue, the super glue fuming causes the super glue to adhere to the page.
That's correct.
Okay. And to one extent, it may help to enhance a fingerprint, right?
Definitely.
Because it will tend to adhere to the portions of the fingerprint that correspond to the ridges on the finger that left the print, correct?
Correct.
If you overfume, if you fume too long or too thoroughly on a piece of paper, you can actually obscure portions of the fingerprint, correct?
That would be true.
Alright, and that's not chemically altering, as far as you're concerned?
Correct.
Okay, thank you. No further questions.
Could I have just a moment, Your Honor? I'm trying to call up an image on my computer that I'd like to show the detective.
Yes.
Do you have an exhibit number?
It is. No, that's not it. It's discussion off the record. I'll do it without the exhibit. Your Honor, could you project input 1, please? Detective, is this the fingerprint that counsel just questioned you about?
Yes, it is.
And I believe I questioned you about it, that there was an error on that fingerprint because it said 3, it says 321D.
That's correct.
And you said that's incorrect?
That is.
Objection. Leading. Calling for recitation of prior testimony.
Overruled.
And in fact, that is 321F?
That's correct.
That's leading, Your Honor.
It's restating his testimony, it's not.
Object to speaking.
It is leading. All sustain the objection.
Okay. What is the accurate letter for that particular item number?
The item number is 321F.
And you said you were certain that that item number is 321F?
That is correct.
Objection. Leading.
Sustained.
Are you certain that that is item 321F?
Yes, I am.
Why?
A couple of things. 1. When we received the magazine, and when we were doing our report at the time we were processing the magazine, we were processing, finally legal. That was the magazine. Subsequently, when we noticed that the tags had been switched, we noticed that 321D was actually associated with the Hawk magazine.
Does the circle that you identified that particular fingerprint with have any similarities to the circle to the right that appears in the image?
Yes, it does.
How so?
You can see that at the edge of the ruler up in the upper right-hand corner of the photograph is the number 1, and that is also illustrated on the actual photograph of the page.
Alright, so, detective, I show you exhibit number 559. It appears to be item 321F. Is that the magazine that fingerprint came from?
Yes, it is.
And is there any indication or mark on this magazine that tells you that this magazine is, in fact, 321F?
On the back page of the magazine there should be a number in the bottom right-hand corner, and it was identified as 321F, and that was placed there when they were first being separated.
Alright, thank you, detective. I have no further questions.
Never trust a lawyer who says there's only a few questions. That's why we started 35 minutes ago. You were in the Santa Barbara County Sheriff's Department, and you are a deputy sheriff. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And you worked as a deputy sheriff before moving into the Forensics Bureau, correct?
That's correct.
And you went to the academy?
Correct.
Which academy?
Ventura Academy.
And that's a post certified academy, correct?
That's correct.
And in the academy, you studied the need to be very accurate in recording material in police reports and elsewhere for the purpose of investigations, correct?
Absolutely.
And the purpose of recording material accurately is so that later, when speaking to other officers or to counsel, or testifying in court, you can present accurate testimony in a case. Is that correct?
That's correct.
You then moved to the Forensics Bureau of the Sheriff's Department. Is that right?
Correct.
And the Forensics Bureau is, in essence, a part of the Sheriff's Department that deals specifically with evidence, sometimes the scientific processing of evidence. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And in the course of your training to become a member of the Forensics Bureau, Was it emphasized that it is extremely important to make sure that all of the evidence tags and paperwork and everything else is extremely accurate?
Absolutely.
Alright, so based on your training and experience, this was not correct police procedure to have this exhibit mislabeled in this case. Is that correct?
It should not have been mislabeled, that's correct.
And tags should not be switched. Is that correct? I think those are your words. The tags were switched.
Yes, meaning not purposely, but accidentally switched.
Well, tags should not be switched, correct?
Correct.
Alright, and you caught this particular one, right?
That was the only one.
That's the only one you caught?
We checked them all.
Objection. Argumentative.
You went back and you checked them all?
There's an objection.
Just a moment. It's overruled. The answer was, we checked them all. Next question.
Checked them all, meaning all the fingerprints?
Checked every magazine to make sure it was properly labeled.
I'm sorry. I meant all the materials that you had for the fingerprints.
Correct.
Were you aware of any other tags falling off in this particular investigation?
Not to my knowledge.
Okay, thank you. No further questions.
No further questions.
Thank you. You may step down. Call your next witness.
Alicia Romero, Your Honor.
Come forward, please. You were sworn yesterday. You're still under oath. You may be seated.
Okay, thank you.
Good morning.
Hi, good morning.
Would you take a look at these while I'm getting ready? Good morning, Miss Romero.
Good morning.
As soon as you sat down, I handed you 2 envelopes, and asked you to take a peek through those.
Okay.
Your Honor, I'm going to ask for the opportunity to see what she's taking a peek at.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
The audience couldn't hear you, though, when you said that.
Can I restate it, or just?
Yes, go ahead.
I asked if I could have the opportunity to take a peek at what she's taking a peek at.
Your Honor, could we go to Input 1, please, and go back to the black screen? Thank you.
That's fine. Let me just take a look at the envelope here.
These came from this envelope here.
Alright, okay. That's fine. Thank you. Thank you, Your Honor.
All right, go ahead, counsel.
Do you recognize the documents contained in both of those envelopes that you looked at?
Yes, I do.
Okay.
Are you referring to these?
Yes.
Yes.
She's got to scoot up and speak into the microphone.
Oh, yes.
Did you hear that? Now, before we start talking about the contents of either of those envelopes, would you please let the jury know who you are and where you're employed?
Okay, my name's Alicia Romero and I work at the Santa Barbara Superior Court.
Closer to the mic, please.
My name is Alicia Romero, and I work at the Santa Barbara Superior Court. I supervise the courtroom clerks, both criminal and civil, and I also am the supervisor of the exhibit clerk, and I also handle the exhibits also.
With respect to your duties as handling exhibits for the Superior Court, were you involved in handling the exhibits lodged in the grand jury proceeding in the case of People v. Michael Jackson?
After the grand jury they were delivered to me, and I've had them in my possession in a vault all this time.
Okay.
Except for certain orders to release.
Okay. That's where we're going next. When the grand jury exhibits came to you, what did you first do with them?
Since it was after hours, we received them, and I locked them right away in the exhibit room, which has a vault that, it's real thick, with a combination lock, until the next morning.
Okay. Did you conduct an inventory on the exhibits after that?
First thing the next morning.
Okay. And you made sure that all the exhibits that had been entered into the grand jury were accounted for in your vault, correct?
Correct.
Okay. And is that part of your official function?
On grand jury exhibits, there's times where I would get orders from Gary Blair to handle them myself.
Okay. And in this particular case you were ordered by Gary Blair?
Correct.
Did anybody have access to the grand jury exhibits that were lodged with you?
The only other person would have been my exhibit clerk at the time, but she was also informed that anything to do with this grand jury exhibits, that she was to contact me and I would handle it. And I also had my other supervisor, Flota Pritchard, in my absence, if it was an emergency need, that she could have access to it also. Other than that, it was just her and I that were to handle them.
Do you know whether any emergencies came up where somebody other than you had to get in there?
I believe.
Calls for hearsay, Your Honor.
Sustained.
Did you keep records of every time that the grand jury exhibits were accessed?
Yes, I did.
And were those records kept within the scope of your employment as a public employee?
Yes.
And were you under a duty to record whenever the grand jury exhibits were opened?
Yes.
And if another clerk, another public employee working for you, had access or needed access to the grand jury exhibits, it was part of your duty to record who entered the grand jury exhibits?
Yes.
And when?
Yes.
And get some kind of identification from who had access to the grand jury evidence?
Yes. Unless we knew who that person was.
Okay. Do you have a record sitting in front of you who had access to the grand jury exhibits?
Yes, I do.
In your review of those documents, can you please tell the jury the first time that the grand jury exhibits were accessed and viewed by people other than the superior court clerks?
Stephen Dunkel and Amy Castle.
Did you take some form of identification from Mr. Dunkel?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Is that noted on your log?
I have their business cards attached to this.
Okay. And Stephen Dunkel works for Sanger and Swyson?
Correct.
Attorneys at law?
Correct.
And Amy Castle works for Mason Investigative Group?
Yes.
An investigator?
Correct.
Okay. And what date did they come look at the exhibits?
June 9, 2004.
Okay. And how long, what time did they come in and what time did they leave, if that is noted on your log?
Yes, it is. They came in at 2:53, and they left at 3:45.
Okay. And which grand jury exhibits did they look at?
This one I just put that they had viewed most of them. I didn't specify particularly which ones they viewed.
Okay. Just most of them?
Correct.
And do you have an indication there that they used gloves?
On this particular one, yes.
Okay. Now, prior to anybody coming to view the grand jury exhibits, was a court order required?
Yes.
Okay. When is the next time somebody came to view the grand jury exhibits, please?
July 20, 2004.
And that was Detective Craig Bonner?
Correct.
Okay. And that was pursuant to a court order as well, correct?
Correct.
Now, was his role that day to take pictures of certain items?
Yes.
And that's what the court order spelled out, correct?
Yes.
And one of those items was Grand Jury Exhibit number 53?
Yes.
May I approach the witness, Your Honor?
Yes.
I've placed before you Exhibit number 470.
Number 470?
When we do the trial, we renumber all the exhibits.
Oh, okay.
You're looking at a Grand Jury Exhibit sticker on the back of that briefcase, are you not?
Yes, I am.
Is that exhibit, Grand Jury Exhibit number 53?
Yes, it is.
Okay. Is that the exhibit that Detective Bonner opened in your presence and took photographs of everything that was in there?
Yes.
Okay. And were you present with him at the time that he did that?
Yes, the entire time.
Did you ever leave grand jury evidence, for example, on the June 9 date? Did you leave the grand jury evidence unattended?
No.
Okay. So you observed everything that would happen with the exhibits?
Yes.
And that's how you were assured there would be no tampering, correct?
Yes.
Did you watch Detective Bonner remove the contents of the briefcase and begin photographing page for page?
Yes.
And Detective Bonner was wearing gloves on that occasion as well, correct?
Yes.
When he was finished photo-documenting all the contents of Grand Jury Exhibit 53, also known as People's Exhibit 470, did he replace all the items in the same order that he removed them and close the briefcase again?
Objection. Compound. And leading.
Should I rephrase?
Sustained.
Okay. When he finished taking the pictures, he put it all back together again.
He placed them back in the suitcase. Whether they were in the same order that they were taken out, I do not know.
So he may have shuffled them, as far as you know?
Correct.
Did he close the briefcase and hand it back to you?
Yes.
Did he examine other exhibits on that same day?
Yes, he did.
Okay. And did he, in your presence, take care to handle only one exhibit at a time?
Yes.
You made sure of that, I take it?
Yes.
Okay. When Detective Bonner left from taking pictures of the exhibits, where did exhibit number 53, also known as exhibit 470, the black briefcase, where did that stay?
Once he left, it was given back to me and I put it back in the vault.
Okay. Did you have occasion to pull exhibit number 470, the black briefcase, marked Grand Jury Exhibit 53, out from the evidence vault again?
Do you mean at a later time? Or the same day?
Later time.
Yes.
Would you turn to your log of exhibits and confirm for us whether somebody entered to view exhibits on July 21st?
Yes.
Who was there on July 21st?
Mr. Sanger and Stephen Dunkel.
Stephen Dunkel would be the attorney who first came to view.
Yes.
And Mr. Sanger, being Mr. Sanger seated to my right?
Yes. Robert Sanger.
And did they examine exhibit number 53 as well?
Yes.
Did they do that in your presence?
Yes.
Did they open it?
Yes.
And do you recall whether they looked through all the contents?
I do not recall if they looked through all of it. I seem vaguely to remember that they viewed some of it, and just saw that they were magazines.
Okay. When they were finished with exhibit number 53, also known as People's 470, the black briefcase. What did you do with it?
After they finished viewing all the exhibits, I put everything back in the vault.
Okay. Do your records show whether exhibit number 53, People's 470, was viewed again prior to its release?
Yes.
When was it next looked at?
July 27, 2004.
And by whom?
Stephen Dunkel and Susan Watts.
That's a third trip by Attorney Dunkel?
Correct.
And Susan Watts, did she leave you some kind of identifying business card?
No, she did not.
Did Mr. Dunkel just vouch for her?
Yes.
Which exhibits did they look at?
Looking at this list, it looks like all of them. I could read out each number, if you like, but I have a whole list of numbers.
Most, if not all the exhibits?
Correct.
Okay. Was exhibit 53 viewed by Mr. Dunkel and Ms. Watts?
Yes.
Do you recall if they were wearing gloves when they went through the exhibits?
The procedure was to wear gloves.
Okay. Was there?
I'm sorry.
Let me back up to the date that Mr. Sanger and Mr. Dunkel reviewed the exhibits on July 21st. Were they wearing gloves?
Mr. Dunkel was. I believe Mr. Sanger was letting Mr. Dunkel handle them on that date, from what I recall.
And how long were Mr. Dunkel and Ms. Watts viewing the evidence on July 27, 2004?
About 1 hour and 10 minutes. They came in at 1:10 p.m. and left about 2:40 p.m.
Okay. Do your records show anyone else coming to look at Grand Jury Exhibit number 53, also known as People's 470, prior to the date of its release?
No.
Okay. What is the procedure for releasing a grand jury exhibit prior to trial?
I'm sorry, what was that question again?
Let me rephrase it. What is the procedure to release a grand jury exhibit to one of the parties prior or before the trial starts?
The parties would have to get a stipulated order signed by the judge.
Okay. And what would you require from the person who would come to pick the item from you?
Identification, and I would have the original, a copy of the order from the clerk.
Okay. Would you take any precautions in preserving either digitally or on some kind of copy the contents of the exhibit that were removed by one of the parties?
Yes.
Okay, you would. And in the case of exhibit number 53, also known as 470, the black briefcase, was that exhibit removed by Detective Craig Bonner pursuant to a judge's order?
Yes, it was.
Okay. And on what date was that exhibit removed from your custody?
On October 1, 2004.
Did you make Mr. Bonner, Detective Bonner, leave you a record of the items that he removed?
Yes.
And how did he leave that with you?
He left me a disc.
Is that in one of your envelopes there?
Yes, it is.
Okay. I'd like to put an exhibit sticker on that, please. That would be item 770, next in order. Could you please describe the item 770 that I just marked the sticker on? Show the jury what is on the front and on the back. Tell them.
This is a disc. These are a disc of the exhibits that were released per court order. I also made a notation, by a post-it, of the date that the court order was ordered and the date of the receipt.
Is there a list of exhibit items that are contained on that CD?
Yes, there is.
And what does that list say?
They have exhibits 33, 34, 52, 53, 73A, 73B, 73C, 80, 82, and 91. These are all grand jury numbers.
Okay. I'd like to admit 770 into evidence, Your Honor.
Objection. Your Honor, it's not relevant. There may be a part of it that's relevant to what just happened. But there's a great deal of irrelevant material on it.
At this time I'll sustain the objection. I'll take it up later, if necessary.
I have no further questions.
Cross-examine?
Miss Romero, how are you?
I'm fine.
Okay, we let you talk today. First of all, is there anything unusual about a defense lawyer coming to, or a defense lawyer and investigator coming to look at grand jury exhibits?
No.
And at the time that Mr. Dunkel from my office came, and the one time that I came to look at the grand jury exhibits, was the grand jury process completed?
Yes.
In other words, the grand jury had already looked at everything, they'd returned their indictment, and you were now safekeeping the exhibits?
Correct.
All right, and in particular, we, that is, the defense, who's representing Mr. Jackson, had to have a court order in order to look at the exhibits. Is that correct?
Right.
When Mr. Dunkel and Ms. Castle came, Miss Castle being an investigator and Mr. Dunkel being a lawyer in my office. When they came, did they ask you if they could take photographs of the exhibits?
Yes, they did.
And you told them that they could not. Is that correct?
Correct.
So it was necessary for us to go back and get a further court order in order to be allowed to take photographs. Is that correct?
Right.
Now, you remember that Miss Watts came with Mr. Dunkel on the third occasion, correct?
Correct.
And at that time, had they received the court order to allow photographs to be taken?
I have to check my notes here.
Sure. Take your time.
This was with Miss Watts, right? And...
Yes. I'll let you take a look. If it's too much trouble, I can ask you another question, which is, did Miss Watts take photographs? Let me try that.
Yes.
All right, so I would assume that you would not have allowed her to take the photographs unless you had an order permitting that. Is that correct?
Correct.
And do you recall Miss Watts being an investigator for our law firm?
Yes.
Okay, now, in between Mr. Dunkel and I came in and looked at the exhibits. At that time we were still not allowed to take photographs, is that correct?
Correct. I don't seem to have an order allowing you to take photos yet at that time.
At that time?
When you came, uh-huh.
All right, now, just to do the whole thing at once so we can break it down, during the time that Mr. Dunkel was there from my office, the one that I was there and the two investigators, in other words, those 3 times, did all of the personnel from my office, including myself, follow all of your directions with regard to preserving and avoiding any contamination of the evidence?
As I recall, yes.
And you were sitting there at the table each time taking the evidence out and allowing whoever it was, whether it was me or any of the others, to look at it, correct?
Correct.
And none of us touched the evidence in any way that you did not want us to do, is that correct?
Correct.
All right, and by the time that we did that, by the time these inspections by the defense occurred, were you told to wear gloves and to preserve the evidence?
Yes, we were. From the very first visit, Mr. Dunkel, and I think it was Castle, were told to wear gloves at all times.
And we all complied with that, right?
Correct.
All right. Now, prior to that, on the day that you got the materials from the grand jury, my understanding is all you did was take them in a box or so?
Yes. Gary Blair and Christy Russell, that was the courtroom clerk, brought them about almost 6 o'clock that evening. And Christy and I, we put it in the vault immediately.
All right. Was anybody wearing gloves?
No.
Okay. And after you put them in the vault, you locked it up, and then you came back the next day, correct?
First thing the next morning, yes.
And who assisted you in inventorying the material?
The courtroom clerk that took the indictment.
And the courtroom clerk was?
Christy Russell.
So you and Miss Russell then took the boxes out, and you went through each exhibit to catalog and make sure it was all there. Is that right?
Correct.
And did each of you wear gloves?
No, we did not.
And you were not instructed by law enforcement or other court personnel or anybody else that you should wear gloves, is that correct?
Correct.
Okay, thank you. I have no further questions.
Just a few, please. Go ahead.
I'm doing my work. Okay.
Essentially, there was nothing improper in the way that the exhibits were handled by other parties in this case, correct?
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
When you did your inventory of the exhibits for the first time, did you open up exhibit number 470, which is the black briefcase that you know as Exhibit 53?
Yes.
Okay. And did you look at every single page that was in there?
No, we did not.
How did you handle that? Could you explain that for the jury, please?
Okay. When we were inventorying, we had this black suitcase. We have to account for every exhibit, so when we got to the black suitcase, our procedure is there anything in there that was overlooked that we should make a note on the exhibit card? So we looked in it, and all we saw was magazines, and we just sort of I think it was myself rather than Christy, we just sort of moved it, just magazines, and then we just closed it, but we didn't touch all the exhibits.
You don't work for law enforcement, do you?
No, I don't.
And law enforcement doesn't get to tell court clerks what to do, right?
Objection. Calls for speculation.
Sustained.
It's rebuttal to his question. I'll rephrase it, Your Honor. When Mr. Sanger asked you whether you were told what to do with the exhibits by law enforcement, is that a common procedure for you?
It wasn't necessarily by law enforcement. It was from Gary Blair.
Okay, so my question is, does law enforcement generally direct you how to handle exhibits once they're lodged with the court?
No, they do not.
They become court property at that point, correct?
Correct.
Okay, I have nothing further.
Okay, but law enforcement did tell you that, after you had inventoried everything, at some point before my office came to look at the materials, somebody told you that everybody should wear gloves when dealing with this material, correct?
It was Gary Blair. And I believe Detective Bonner at one time did mention, you clerks, you should really wear gloves when you're handling it. It wasn't an order. It was more like a request.
All right.
But I took my instructions from Gary Blair.
Gary Blair is the court administrator?
Yes, he is.
So he would be your boss, as it were?
Correct.
When you say you don't take direction from law enforcement on handling exhibits, well, I don't know what you said, but I don't want to put words in your mouth. Let's put it this way. The fact is, that you've been a courtroom clerk in the past, correct?
Correct.
And the fact is, if law enforcement is handling something with gloves and they indicate there may be some reason to check something for fingerprints, you would act accordingly, correct?
Correct.
Okay, so if law enforcement were to tell you, if they had told you before you took possession of these items that you shouldn't go through them because they may be checking them for fingerprints, you would have honored that request, right?
Yes, I would have.
Okay, and that has happened before, has it not?
Correct.
Okay, all right, thank you. No further questions.
No redirect, Your Honor.
All right. Thank you. You may step down.
Thank you.
We'll call Nancy Torres as our next witness.
All right. Come forward, please. When you get to the witness stand, please remain standing. Face the clerk over here. And raise your right hand.
I do.
Please be seated. State and spell your name for the record.
Nancy Diana Torres. Torres.
Thank you.
Good morning, Ms. Torres.
Good morning.
Who do you work for, please?
I work for the Santa Barbara Sheriff's Department, Forensics Unit.
And what do you do for the Santa Barbara Sheriff's Forensic Unit?
I'm an identification technician in the Forensics Unit.
What is an identification technician?
We basically do the same thing as a forensics detective. We go out to a crime scene and process it. We also do fingerprint work.
How long have you been an identification technician?
I have been employed as an ID technician for 5 years.
Have you received any training that qualifies you for that position?
Yes, I have gone to basic fingerprint pattern type recognition courses, latent print comparison and techniques courses, as well as basic forensic radiology courses. And I have a Bachelor's of Science degree in chemistry.
Have you had some experience in the field that has helped you learn your craft in fingerprint identification procedures?
Yes, every day we do fingerprint comparisons.
And what techniques are you familiar with in terms of finding fingerprints?
Well, we use a lot of various chemical techniques, and, as well as visual techniques that we use.
Did you participate in the location of fingerprints on a series of magazines for the case of People vs. Michael Jackson?
Yes, I did.
I'd like to show you some exhibits at this time, and begin by asking you, did you participate in the procedure of attempting to locate prints on these items with another ID technician?
Yes, I did.
And who was that?
My partner was Detective Sutcliffe.
Okay. And was he present with you during the entire time that you did the examination of these magazines?
Yes, he was.
Alright. Showing you People's 725, Card 02. Did you help in the processing of this particular magazine?
Yes, I did.
What was your duty on this magazine?
I helped with the ninhydrin processing portion of it.
Okay. Exhibit 726, 03. Did you help process this particular magazine?
Yes, I did.
What was your duty or what did you do on this particular magazine?
I helped with the ninhydrin processing of them.
Exhibit 728, Card 05. Same question. Did you help in processing this?
Yes.
What did you do?
A ninhydrin processing as well.
Same question for 729, Card 06?
Yes. With the ninhydrin processing.
Exhibit 730, Card 07, same question?
Yes. And the ninhydrin processing as well.
731, Card number 8?
Yes. With the ninhydrin processing as well.
Alright. 732, Card 09?
Yes. Ninhydrin process.
Alright. Now, calling your attention to Exhibit 733, Card 10. What did you do in processing this particular latent?
I photographed the latent with a scenescope and I also helped with the ninhydrin processing.
Okay. Were you the finder of this particular print?
Yes, I was.
All right. We'll take our break.